we've done the anatomy of the sympathetic trunk. And we know that, just to review really quick, that here's my spinal cord section. And there's my little butterfly in the middle. And that is not the most symmetrical thing I've ever seen, but it's going to work. And we know that all sympathetic innervation is going to start here in the lateral horn with the first neuron in the chain, the preganglionic neuron. And actually, before I continue, I really do need to add the rest of my spinal nerve for context. This is my anterior root. And then they're going to come together to make my spinal nerve. And then I do a little circle at the end of that. And these would continue on, like there's the posterior rami and the anterior rami and so on. Okay, so my preganglionic neuron is going to start here in the lateral horn. That's where the cell body is. And the axon is going to travel out through the anterior root into the spinal nerve. And then, oh, you know what? My apologies, I left something important off here. There should be 2 entryways into there. That's a split between the 2 rami. And then the preganglionic neuron would take the second turn down the white ramus and enter the sympathetic trunk. And from there, what happens next depends. It depends on which pathway. This one, this one, this one, or this one. You have 4 different options for what could happen next and where your postganglionic neuron should be. Now, we're not going to take a deep dive into each of those pathways because each of them is really very different from the other one. They're going to take different routes and go to different places. The one thing that I do want you to know, I want you to know where they're going. Like what organs are each of these pathways going to target? So I'll go through that one by one. Sympathetic pathway number 1. We call this the spinal nerve pathway, and that's because it goes back to the spinal nerve. So your preganglionic neuron starts here, as always, in the lateral horn, sends its axon through the anterior root into the spinal nerve and into the sympathetic trunk. And from there, the postganglionic neuron, which I'm going to do in green, goes out back to the spinal nerve. Now, don't need you to know that specifically, that it goes back to the spinal nerve. I'm just telling you that because that's what its name is, and I'm explaining why it's got that name. Now, where it's going is what I do want you to know. And it shows you here, hopefully you recognize, that's skin. And it also goes to blood vessels. So it will do things like raise your blood pressure, so increase blood pressure. And it does that by actually constricting the vessels, what we would call vasoconstriction. If you make the blood vessels more narrow, it will increase your blood pressure. And it does that throughout your body. Mostly it's going to be effective in your limbs where a lot of that vasoconstriction is going to take place. And that will raise your blood pressure overall. And it also goes to your skin. And the things it would do on your skin include sweat. You get all sweaty from sympathetic stimulation, nervous sweat. Think of it that way. And then also what they call the erector pili. And you don't need to spell this. You just need to know goosebumps. It's going to cause the hair on your body to stand up, erect, like goosebumps. So that's the kind of target organs. So in the skin, your sweat glands and the muscles that make your hair rise and stand on end, those 2 things. And another thing it's going to target is blood vessels to cause your blood pressure to go up. Okay, sympathetic pathway number 1, which has a stupid name because every single pathway has a postganglionic neuron, and it's annoying. I think it should have a different name, but that's the name we're stuck with, so I'm sorry. I think it should be called thoracic sympathetic nerve pathway because that's where it's going, is primarily organs in your thorax. But that is not the name, so forget that name, thorax. It's called the postganglionic sympathetic nerve pathway. And where is it going? Organs in the thorax, so your heart is the primary one. If you knew heart, a little bit of lungs, that's great. So it's actually going to raise your heart rate. Sympathetic stimulation. It's actually going to open up your airways. So it's going to do what we call bronchodilation. And that is when your airways open up so that you can get more air inside. So that's what the second nerve pathway does. Increase heart rate, open up your airways, or what we call bronchodilation. Third pathway, the splanchnic nerve pathway. This one goes to, you're kind of guess what that is, digestive system. That's good enough if you just knew that. What does it do to the digestive system? It'll decrease activity in your digestive system. So maybe we could even do that a different color to make it, okay, decreasing digestive system activity, because you don't want to waste any time or energy digesting your food. It does take a little bit of energy to actually digest and absorb your food. You get more energy in the end, but it takes time. And right now you just need to immediately send all of your effort to, say, your limbs and your heart in order to flee from the bear. So turn your digestive system off, and that splanchnic nerve, the third pathway, will do that. Then, oops, I had a lot of discussion of splanchnic nerves that you don't have to dive deep into. The final pathway, the adrenal medulla pathway. So first of all, I need to talk about what the adrenal gland is. And so I hope you recognize this is the kidney. That is not the adrenal gland. But sitting on top of the kidney, kind of like a hat here, sitting on top of your kidneys is your adrenal gland. And your adrenal gland actually has two parts. This is really common for an organ to have two parts. It's got the outer part, and the outer part is called, just write it over here, the outer layer is called the cortex. That's really common, actually. That's what your brain has. The cortex, the cerebral cortex, is the gray layer on the outside of your cerebrum and your cerebellum. And then the inner part, or the creamy filling in the middle, so let's just say the inner portion, because it's not so much a layer, it's just a chunk inside with a cortex around it. The inner portion is called the medulla. Now, the adrenal cortex secretes a different set of hormones. We call these like corticosteroid hormones. And those are, I misspelled that, my apologies, steroid. Those are something you may take like prednisone, that if you work in healthcare already, you already know what those are. I'm not going to ask you about them, so don't worry about them. However, the medulla secretes different hormones. The medulla secretes, these are the hormones I do want you to know. Epinephrine. Actually, we'll just go with epinephrine. There's another related one called norepinephrine that's very, very similar. But epinephrine, actually, you may have heard of because of EpiPens. EpiPen is epinephrine. So you can give somebody an injection of what their adrenal medulla makes naturally if you really need to, wake up their sympathetic system. And why would you need to do that? Well, let me just back up for a minute and say, what does epinephrine do, broadly speaking? Epinephrine's job is, its function is to prolong sympathetic response. So you've already triggered all your other pathways. So your heart rate is going up, you're sweating, my apologies, response. You're going to prolong your sympathetic response. I can't always type and write at the same time. Anyway, so you're going to prolong your sympathetic response. You want to keep your heart rate up. You want to keep sweating. You want to keep your blood pressure up. You want to keep your digestive system inactive. Keep it down. Keep that activity down. And the epinephrine running through your bloodstream will keep that sympathetic response going for as maybe long as you need to do it. So the adrenaline rush, that is epinephrine. Call it an epinephrine rush. It's actually triggered neurologically first, and then it's maintained and kept at a high level when you secrete epinephrine into your blood. So why do people get EpiPens? One of the most common reasons for an EpiPen injection is for an allergic reaction. And in the case of an allergic reaction, your body thinks that something is harmful, like pollen or a bee sting, when in fact it's not really harmful. But your body's reaction is going to be to panic, for instance. And so let's just take lungs, for example. It's going to close off your airways. And that's bad because you can't breathe. So one of the things an EpiPen will do is, again, increase heart rate, which is what you need if you're having an allergic reaction, but especially you're going to need to increase your bronchodilation, open up your airways. And so you can kind of circumvent your sympathetic system by injecting this hormone in somebody. It'll cause the same effect. It'll cause a sympathetic response, only you're doing it, artificially. So yeah, you can do it naturally or you can do it artificially if needed. But again, that's the fourth pathway, and what I want you to know about it is the target. The target is the adrenal medulla, and the adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine. Okay, so that is your sympathetic system. One last concept that is very easy at this point, hopefully, is this idea of dual innervation. Dual meaning two things, and often two things that are opposite of each other. It's generally what we meant by like a duel, like two guns pointing at each other. That's somebody who's dueling. So these are two things that are opposite. Two things that are opposite. And they're coming from, the nervous system. And those two things, of course, would be the two divisions. Sympathetic versus parasympathetic. And they each will innervate the same set of organs, but they'll do opposite things to them. So for instance, heart rate. Sympathetic system is going to increase your heart rate, whereas parasympathetic is going to decrease your heart rate. So they do opposite things, but they're both targeting the heart. What about gastrointestinal tract? That would be your intestines. What do the two things do to your intestines? Well, the sympathetic system is going to slow it down and stop it. Parasympathetic system, it's rest and digest. It's going to increase the activity of your gut because you're watching Netflix and eating potato chips. So that's going to be parasympathetic effect. Pupil diameter. So in the case of the pupil, sympathetic system is going to increase the size of your pupils so that you can see the bear better before it kills you. And then your parasympathetic actually constricts your pupils. Even though you're watching Netflix, Netflix can be seen well enough even with constricted pupils and kind of a relaxed position, I guess you could say, of your pupils. So you can see that dual innervation just means there's two divisions and they do opposite things to each organ. They both innervate the heart, but they do opposite things to the heart. They both innervate the intestines, but they do opposite things to the intestines. They both innervate your pupils, and they do opposite things. So those are the three good examples of dual innervation that I want you to know. Okay, that's chapter 18.